Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm very honored and very with you this afternoon, and thank you very much for coming and for joining me. It's really an honor to be among such wonderful philosophers who are going to present here, and I'm really grateful to Tereza. Tereza, thank you so much for this invitation. I have to say, I'm just very, very sorry that I couldn't be in your beautiful city. I was there when I was in high school, and remember, it's one of the most beautiful cities I've ever seen. And I'm just really hoping that at some point, when all of this is over, we will be able to meet and to talk philosophy and other things over your amazing beer. I remember your beer. It's the only place in the world when I drink beer. So hopefully I'm gonna visit your country again. So thank you very, very much for having me. Tereza, can I share my screen? Because I think it will be easier if people have access to my PowerPoint.
It will be possible, just go ahead.
Okay, let me just, so screen share. Okay, so I think you should be able to see it now. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually part of a much greater research project that I'm currently working with. And it is the research project dedicated to ethical and to cognitive value of art. And of course, given that all of these topics begin and end apparently with Plato, when Tereza invited me to this talk, I would be a very good opportunity for me to kind of go back and revisit some of the Plato's arguments. And as I will show in this talk, part of the reason why Plato's call is so relevant today is because we have all sorts of ethical issues, as Tereza nicely put it, of immoral art, where as philosophers and philosophers of art in particularly, I think we should kind of attend to these things. So with your help, I'm hoping to solve some of the problematic cases that I will be listing here for you today. So just to kind of remind us, Plato's calls to censorship is developed throughout his writings and several of his dialogues. I won't be going through his arguments here. I will focus just on this one particular claim where he says, cautiously, he says, nonetheless, we are aware that hymns to the gods and eulogies of good people are the only poetry we can admit into our city. For if you admit the honeyed muse, whether in lyric or epic poetry, pleasure and pain will be kings of your city instead of law and the things that has always been generally believed to be best, reason. So what Plato is doing here, he's kind of warning us that if we give ourselves too much into art, or more importantly, if we allow ourselves to be taken over by certain problematic works of art, we will end up on the wrong side of our intellectual, so to speak, endeavors, and we will be facing all sorts of trouble. So that's kind of the core of Plato's calls to censorship. The idea being that we need to be very careful because art can, for many different reasons, be extremely dangerous. And as I mentioned, this is part of a wider project, and what I'm interested in within this project is to actually explore what are some of the ways in which art can be dangerous in this manner. And of course, I'm not the only one, and it seems that last year in particular was very fruitful for these kind of topics, and two amazing books came out. One is by James Harrell, Dangerous Art, and the other one is by Ted Nannicelli, Artistication and Ethical Criticism. So what is very interesting about two books is they kind of present entirely opposite views. So with Harrell, you have this idea that art belongs to a separate a domain which is not or should necessarily be judged by ethical standards. And with Ted Nannicelli, you have something very similar to Plato in the sense that Ted Nannicelli is much more cautious over ethical criticism of art. So I'm kind of working now within the boundaries set by these two books, though for my discussion today, I will be considering Ted Nannicelli's view, simply because he is currently at least much closer to those things that interest me. So when I mention problematic case, let me just give you an overview of what these might be. So I assume that you are familiar with the examples that I have laid out here. So these are some of the most popular television series over the past decade or so. Going from the beginning, this is the Sons of Anarchy, the widely famous Sopranos, Breaking Bad, and Dexter. So the reason why philosophers who study ethical character of art are interested in this series is the fact that they represent, for the most part, characters who are extremely morally flawed. So it's not like in the, let's say, great works of literature where you have a kind of a hero who is trying to overcome his problems, but he or she is always, in some sense, very moral and very praiseworthy. What happened in television recently over the past, let's say, 3 decades, is this overflooding, so to speak, of characters who are neither moral heroes, nor are they morally praiseworthy, which the idea is art should kind of present to us. So all of these characters in for different reasons and in different degrees, but all of them are in some sense deeply problematic. Some of them become morally problematic, like in the case of Breaking Bad, right? One can argue that Walter has a very good reason to become a kind of a drug king. You can also argue it's interesting to question Dexter Morgan's ethical code. He's only killing the bad people. Those people who avoid justice and legal system. So in a sense, they can be excused, right? But on the other hand, with series like the Sopranos or the Sons of Anarchy, there is this idea that these guys are just really bad people, which would be fine, right? There are bad people among us, so that would be fine. But the problem is the way that these characters are presented, the way in which the narratives are told, right? Through the artistic means, through representational means, through emotional attachment, etc. We kind of tend to like them, right? So not many people, I assume, would watch The Sopranos waiting for the moment that Tony will be caught, right? Rather, you are watching and you take some kind of a pleasure or enjoyment knowing that he successfully eludes the police, the justice system, the legal system, other mafia people who are trying to kill him, etc., right? And then you kind of remember Plato going, well, that's just very wrong, right? Because we shouldn't be cheering for bad people, right? And of course, Plato's views were much more complicated than I'm presenting them here, because he had this idea that you identify with the character, and by identifying with the character, you kind of take over his or her moral attitudes, right? And that's very problematic, because by repeatedly engaging with Tony Soprano, and there's like over 100 of hours if you watch the entire show, right? You just might develop some ethical traits or moral flaws which are deeply, deeply concerning. So this kind of series represent quite a big of a challenge for philosophers of art, because they are just portraying very bad people in a very, very, very appealing way. So if there ever was a fruitful floor for Plato's criticism, this kind of works would definitely be good candidate. And of course, as you notice, I'm using the examples from what is usually called the low art category. So someone might object that Plato did not low art, he only taught good art. I'll have something more to say about that later. My reasons for choosing this is that not only are these series quite often discussed by philosophers, but also they are very, very popular, and they are widely accessible to great amount of audience. So that's one example. So you have a work of art, low art, never mind, which is presenting you something morally flawed in a very, very appealing way. But there are many other cases which Plato probably wasn't considering, but cases which matter for us today. One domain refers to the moral character of the artists themselves. And what I'm showing you here, I'm sure you can recognize there is a range of people who were throughout most of their lives, actually throughout most of their careers, extremely famous and extremely highly praised for their artistic achievements. So whether it's Kevin Spacey being absolutely amazing actor, or Dustin Hoffman, or Bill Cosby, whether it is Placido Domingo, who just sings amazingly beautiful, I've also decided to include here an example of John Galliano. I don't know whether you consider fashion to be a form of art, but it definitely is a form of artistic expression, which is rather dominant in our culture. Unlike the other gentleman here, Galliano was not involved in a sexual stuff, but he did have some quite ugly outbursts, which caused him to lose his job and his career, etc. So what these examples, and of course the rest of these people here have all been charged or at least accused of some kind of sexual misconduct. So this is just an example of what Kevin Spacey apparently did. So he routinely preyed on young actors, particularly those under 30. It was so common that it became a local joke in poor taste. So, and as you probably are aware of the fact that most of these people at some point were fired from their position. In some cases, they could no longer perform, or some of their works were revoked. And what this example showed is that we do kind of consider the moral character of the artist to be relevant for our engagements with art. Of course, probably still the most famous case is by the case of Polanski, who was charged for rape of a young girl, and watching his movie because there is some kind of a connection between the morally bad character of the artist and the work that he or she is producing. Although in most of these cases, or in some of these cases, the content of the artwork itself doesn't necessarily have to be flawed, morally flawed in any way. So there is a difference between my previous set of examples where there is something ethically wrong with the character of the work itself, and these cases where there is something wrong or apparently something wrong with the people doing the art, right, with the artists themselves. And then there is also another rather relevant set of cases, which these are the cases which refer to the artistic production, right? Not the artistic production in a very wide sense of the where there is something, some kind of interaction that goes on between the artist and the performance. I'm giving you the example from my own hometown. I don't know if you know, but throughout the Corona year, Rijeka was actually the European capital of culture. And it was supposed to have all sorts of different programs. And this movie called The Children of the Port, Djeca Luke, was supposed to be one of them. Now, because of the Corona, they couldn't hold the public performance. So they decided to make a movie and to show a movie on the final night of this year-long Capital of Culture title. But apparently, when the people in charge of this title saw the final movie, they very abruptly closed down the production. They dismissed the movie from the program, and they even went so far as to call the I'm not sure about the English translation, but basically the highest legal institution in Croatia, and they demanded legal sanctions against the person who did this, who produced the movie, claiming that there are certain scenes and situations in the film which should not feature children and should not be presented in front of the children. They charged this filmmaker with sexualizing of children and with showing a lot of cursing and aggressive behavior. And what you have here is a still from the movie. So obviously it's a very, very young girl who is she dances seductively and she's dressed in a very, very provocative way. And the idea here is that we just should not expose our children, because this was a movie for the children. The idea was we should not expose our children to such sexualization, not only as the audience, but also in the process of making the movie. Now, there is a much wider story. I can go back to this in Q&A if you are interested, but this is just an example which shows that there are certain moments of creation of art, of artistic production itself, which can be rather problematic. To go to probably much more famous case, this is the famous rape scene from The Last Tango in Paris. A few years ago, the leading female character, the actor who portrayed her, publicly said that she wasn't given full information about the details of how the movie is going to be made. She said that they basically record that it wasn't that she wasn't introduced to how the rape scene is going to be made, and the rape scene was very, very brutal. It involved a case of butter and all sorts of very, very intrusive sexual movements performed by Marlon Brando, who apparently did know what he was supposed to do, right? So when she came out and with this statement, many people suggested that the movie should no longer be given the high art status that it has. And this is very commonly now taken as an example of immoral, as an immoral example of how certain art comes to be. So that's my array of immoral art, and I'm using immoral in the sense of, okay, let's see whether these are really immoral works of art and what are we supposed to do. So basically the idea is, given the vast amount of the examples of immoral art, and again, immoral in the very wide sense of immorality, it seems that we have some reasons at least to go back to Plato's claims and reevaluate his concern. And what I want to stress out is that this isn't necessarily an engagement with debate considering autonomism versus ethicism, right? So I'm not interested in the question of whether, as James Herold, for example, is, whether ethics and art and ethics and aesthetics are separate domains, right? So I think that there is a relevance to the ethical evaluation of art independently of whether you think that art is autonomous practice. And the reason for that is the following. So first of all, the practice, sorry for the misspelling here, the practice of ethical evaluation is a very relevant aspect of our art engagement. So there's something in us, in the sense that when we watch works of art, or when we hear about cases like Kevin Spacey case, etc., we do tend to react not only from the point of view of aesthetic agents or artistic agents, but also from the point of view or moral agents, right? So we do tend to consider works of art as inviting some kind of an ethical evaluation. And to add up to that, right, probably in your country as well, but in many countries, it is part of a high school education to approach art in this manner. So very often you will be talking about your, as a child, as students, as pupils, or if you are on the other side, right, as teachers, as professors of literature or film or ethics and philosophy, right? We quite often tend to talk about ethical content of works of art. So I think these two reasons are already sufficient to kind of take this idea of immoral art seriously, or at least to recognize the public value of ethical evaluation of art. And I will add up to this idea as I go along. So I hope to convince you by the time I'm done with my talk, I hope I will be able to convince you that there is something morally important, but also culturally and educationally relevant about the ethical evaluation of art that we do. So what I'm doing, as I said, part of the wider project, but also here, right, I want to provide a context within which we can develop an ethical criticism of primarily narrative art. So I will be mostly concerned with my first area of cases, which is those artworks which are problematic in terms of their content, right? So I want to provide a context in which we develop ethical criticism of such works of art, where the account of ethical criticism that I want to come up with is one which has public relevance and is not limited to philosophical discussions characterized by value interaction debate or conducted solely under the banner of aesthetic cognitivism. So to put the point bluntly, so far it is only philosophers who are debating these things. And if you are a philosopher debating these issues, you are engaged in the value interaction debate. So your question is whether the ethical and aesthetic value of a work of art relate in some way, and if they do, how they do. Or you are an aesthetic cognitivist or anti-cognitivist, and you are trying to show or refute the view that there is something cognitively valuable about art. So these are the two contexts where these sorts of questions are most commonly asked. And what I'm hoping to show is that we have reasons, we have good reasons to extend our discussion of ethical value of art above these two contexts, and to engage, as I'll show towards the end of my talk, also some other disciplines and also some other philosophical areas. So if this is my project, or if this is my aim, how am I supposed to proceed? And in order to proceed, right, I'm relying here on the options provided by Ted Nannicelli, who talks about ethical criticism and then kind of develops two ways in which a work of art can be ethically evaluated. So he basically, most of the book is dedicated to justifying an approach to ethical criticism, which he calls production-oriented approach. And he says, and he kind of argues that within our public space and legal context, this is a dominant form of ethical evaluation of art. And this dominant form basically focuses on the means of production of a certain work and evaluates it ethically according to how it came about. So what Nannicelli prefers is to talk about those examples which were listed as my second, and so moral character of the maker, including cases like Kevin Spacey's controversy, or the entire process of creating a work of art, which goes back to the rape scene of The Last Tango in Paris, or to the sexualization of children that was publicly rather popular case it has been for the last 10 days. That's pretty much all that people in Rijeka are debating. And I do think there is quite a lot of value in what Nannicelli is doing here. But because my main focus always is on narrative art, I'm much more concerned with what he has to say regarding the ethical criticism of narrative art. And this is something that he kind of puts to the other way in which ethical criticism can proceed. And this is called perspectivism, which is just, as he says, the most common manner in which we talk about narrative art. So ethical criticism of art is directed at the perspective presented and advocated within an artwork. And here is the crucial point, right? If such a perspective is for some reason morally blameworthy, the work itself is subject to ethical criticism, and that would add also to aesthetic criticism, since ethical flaw can mar the work's overall value. So this is my rephrasing of Nannicelli, but basically here you can see how the problem of the ethical value of art is kind of hidden behind the value interaction debate. And obviously, this is something that is very, very close to the initial quote from Plato that I've given you. Because if you remember, Plato was concerned with were those works which are kind of representing immoral deeds in some kind of an appealing way. So in that sense, I would say that most contemporary philosophers who talk about ethical criticism of art are in some way evoking or echoing some of the most dominant views expressed by Plato, which is why I'm kind of naming this talk Plato's Call to Art, right? It still reverberates in our contemporary practices. So throughout most of his book, Nannicelli is concerned with perspectivism, and perspectivism as such originates in the work of Boris Gaut, or at least it's most commonly related to the work of Boris Gaut. And here is how he develops perspectivism. He says, I construe intrinsic ethical value in terms of the ethical features of the attitude that the work manifests. The notion of an attitude should be understood to cover not just characteristically affective states, such as showing disgust toward or approval of the characters, but also to cover more purely cognitive states, such as presenting characters in such a way as to imply judgments about their being evil, good, inspiring, and so on. Thus, in assessing the ethical value of art, we are assessing the ethical quality of the point of view, cognitive and affective, that it takes towards certain situations. So the idea here is that there is a certain perspective which is kind of developed throughout the work of art. And if there is something morally wrong with this perspective, the entire work of art as such should be subject to ethical criticism. So to go back to my original examples, right, given that, for example, Tony Soprano, for all of his ethical problems, right, and the problems of his ethical character, he is still kind of presented in manner which does not necessarily judge him, right? The entire show doesn't ask you to judge him. It kind of asks you to cheer for him, to be on his side, right? So in that sense, you could say that the attitude of the series toward immoral people, toward the criminal, toward the mafia, etc., is in some way positive or embracing. And that's the problem, apparently, with perspectivism. Now, I have to say, I do have my concerns regarding perspectivism. I think it is a wrong way in which to talk about ethical criticism of art, and in the wider schema of things, I do offer reasons as to why we should avoid reducing the entire work of art to a single ethical perspective. But I won't talk about that today, though we can discuss it later on in Q&A. What I want to talk about today is one of the arguments that Nannicelli finds problematic with perspectivism. So he gives several reasons as to why we should avoid perspectivism. He says it's philosophers' only game, which is pretty much true. Philosophers and, let's say, high school teachers who are educating us and talk about great works of literature. So on this view, perspectivism doesn't have public relevance that Nannicelli thinks it should have. He also says that it is public, he rejects it on the account of being infertile with respect to public. So there are many countries in the world which are happy to show Sons of Anarchy or The Sopranos, because these are very popular shows, right? So they are kind of alluring, they're alluring to a lot of people, right? And if there really is something morally problematic, then we shouldn't be, these works of art or art entertainment or low art, however you want to call them, they shouldn't necessarily be so publicly available. Then Nannicelli then gives all sorts of reasons as to why there are many problems with trying to identify the piece. So whether or not we can really embrace a certain perspective depends on identifying the perspective. And he then goes on into very elaborate discussion about the meaning of the work, the intentions of the author, etc. We can talk about that, but what I find most important for our approach to art, to ethical criticism of art, is something that he refers to as empirical support for perspective. And what does that mean? So here is a quote to make it more easily comprehensible. So for perspectivism to stand, and of course by perspectivism he means ethical criticism of art at the ethical character of the work or at the perspective that the work apparently puts forward, right? So for P to stand, it needs to demonstrate that a particular artwork has had specific concrete effects on someone or some people, in virtue of which the work is morally evaluable. Most philosophers of art writing on this topic acknowledge this difficulty and attempt to distance their views from these sorts of specific causal claims. Now, in my work, I refer to this as the empirical challenge to, sorry again for the misspelling, the empirical challenge to causal claim. So remember, right, that the idea is, as Plato originally formulated it, if we expose ourselves to the wrong kind of work, right, if we expose ourselves to morally problematic works of art, that work of art will affect us in deeply problematic ways, right? So there is the sense in which art can causally affect how we react towards the world, right? Art can do something to our moral agency, right? So art can be the cause, right, of our moral deterioration. That was at least what Plato saw. Now, this empirical challenge, right, to causal claim regarding art's impact on the audience can also, in modern times, nowadays, be traced back to Barry Scott in his book, where he says there are 5 big questions regarding ethics and art. And the first among these is what he calls causal questions. So the one asking if exposure to works of art tends to affect us morally. And now this is the option that Plato wasn't considering that much, morally to improve or morally to corrupt us. Or to be more fair toward Plato wanted to censor all the art which could morally corrupt us, and he only wanted to import or to allow those works which can morally improve us. So works which today we tend to refer as didactic works of art. So that's the empirical challenge, right? And the problem is that empirical challenge is not really taken seriously within the context in which which it is most commonly involved, right? So aesthetic cognitivism and value interaction debate, for the most part, continue, right? So people develop their theories without actually taking care about the empirical challenge and about the causal claim. So just to give you an example, probably a very famous, one of the most famous defenders of aesthetic cognitivism, Martha Nussbaum. So this is a quote from one of her many writings on this topic. For stories cultivate our ability to see and care for particulars, to respond vigorously with senses and emotions before the new, to care deeply about chance happenings in the world rather than to fortify ourselves against them. So notice that when Nussbaum describes how art, how stories, how narration, how representations impact us, she kind of presupposes that we change somehow in the process of art engagement. So that's one of the examples where, in order to defend such a view, you really have to presume that art indeed has causal impact on us. And of course, such view originates with Plato, but then it's most famously advocated by Aristotle, right? As Aristotle claimed that the pleasure in mimesis is morally corruptive, is not really productive, sorry, but instructive and beneficial for the emotions, right? So implicitly or not, but there is the assumption of causal claim, right? And most of defenders of aesthetic cognitivism of the history this idea, and they assume positive moral impact of art. So most people will say, as we saw with Martin Nussbaum, yes, you should engage with art because it does wonders for your ethical character. Not many people, have to say, were cautious about the claim. So it was only Joshua Landy and Alan Goldman 10 years ago when I was working on my PhD. Only these two people were kind of cautious, and they would say, like, okay, it can go either way, right? You can become better, but you can also become worse. And this is better or worse is something that is now actually becoming clear to people. So of course the empirical challenge can also be traced back to Plato. He kind of gives it a slightly different reading. So he is, at one point, he is demanding those who from those who defend the public value of art or some kind of artistic cognitivism, right? They want to know, he wants to know, this is a quote, right? What city gives you credit for being a good lawgiver who benefited this, as Italy and Sicily do to Charondas, I think, and as we do to Solon? Who gives such credit to you? Will he be able to name one? And then, of course, the answer is none, right? So regardless of all the amazing things that Homer writes about, taking care of the city and being a lawmaker, etc., no one, in fact, turns to Homer or to writers or to performers and ask them for any kind of advice or any kind of help when you really have a problem. More contemporary take on this challenge was given by Peter Lamarck, who said, would we expect that those immersed in the great works of literature understand people and the world better than those who are not so well read? Yet there seems no evidence that such readers are especially knowledgeable about human traits, as are psychologists or social scientists or even philosophers. Literary critics are not sought out as experts or advisors on human affairs. And of course, you can extend this to moral, to domain morality, and say there's absolutely no evidence that people who read a lot, or for example, your colleagues from arts departments and literature departments, are in any way morally better than the majority or the rest of us. And of course, the empirical challenge has been taking quite a lot of value recently. Probably one of the most interesting cases is Greg Carr. Greg Carr used to defend aesthetic cognitivism, but lately he has kind of changed his mind, and now he says everything depends in the end on whether we can find direct causal evidence. We need to show that exposure to literature itself makes some sort of positive difference to the people we end up being, right? The idea is we end up being after engagements with work of art. Now, research, of course, personal evidence has been conducted, not necessarily within philosophy, but there were people who were interested in these kinds of problems. So there was quite a lot of research on pornography and violent video games, where people wanted to see whether frequent exposure to pornography will have any impact on people who, or on sexual habits of people, in particularly toward women, right? And there are also quite a lot of research and quite extensive research on whether or not playing violent video games where you have to kill everyone around you, whether that makes you more aggressive or less tolerant and whatever. And of course, the problem is that all of this research is inconclusive. So that's part of the problem. Now, when philosophers join psychologists, they are usually, I would say, more optimistic, and or you can say more in line with Aristotle, and they like to believe that we become morally better. So what philosophers will say, yes, of course, we do become morally better. One way in which this is evident is because we increase our empathy. So we become more empathic towards those in need, or toward those who suffer, or towards, for example, different kinds of people. If you think about, I don't know, homosexuals, for example, there are philosophers who claim that movies like Philadelphia, which portray a homosexual person played by Tom Hanks, is kind of capable of increasing your empathy towards the various kinds of discrimination that homosexual people suffer on a daily basis. Another manner in which art is supposed to make us better is social understanding, right? So we become better at reading other people's mind, predicting their behavior, and also much better in kind of understanding the reasons they have for certain kind of actions, right? And some of the most optimistic would also say that we increase our virtues. We can become morally better if we engage with good works of art. However, there are also reasons to be careful about this, because such research, and this is the problem, such research has not been uniquely corroborated. So for every research which shows, okay, we do become better, there is a research which kind of mars the original one and shows that for whatever reasons, and there are many reasons, we can talk about that, you can't really claim any of this positive view. Now, as we saw, Greg Carr takes this to kind of reject aesthetic cognitivism, to reject the view that art makes us better. For Nannicelli, this is a quote from him. He says, "I'm skeptical that there is a principled distinction to be made between the kind of specific causal claims philosophers tend to avoid and the broader causal claims some of them endorse, such that our engagement with certain artworks inculcates moral knowledge or clarifies moral understanding." So what Nannicelli wants to say is that you can't really coherently claim that there is an impact of art on people, but and not provide any kind of evidence for that being the case. So to sum up, there are two problems with empirical research. For one, it's inconclusive. And then, of course, you can say, well, that's not a problem. Let's just do some more research, right? Let's collect the money. Let's find a willing subject and let's just do more research. But recently, people like Nannicelli and Gott and Ralph McGregor, they all show and they give rather convincing arguments that the very possibility of doing this kind of research is actually they're quite skeptical over whether that is possible. And they will give you all sorts of reasons, right? So one goes back to choosing the works of literature that you want to use. Another one asks, well, how are you going to measure the impact? The third one asks, who is going to be your control group, etc. So for all sorts of reasons, right? There is the idea that we can't really measure the impact of art, the impact of literature or of the movies, and we can't really prove, we will never be able to prove whether or not causal claim is true. I'm kind of speeding up because I think I'm running out of time now. So what can you do, right? If you are someone defending the cognitive and ethical value of art, and then obviously you can't do the research, what are you going to do? Well, one option is to just continue the debate within value interaction debate, which I mentioned before, the relation between ethics and aesthetics. So this is what God does, right? He says there is no entailment from the claim that ethicism is true. And of course, ethicism is his theory that the ethical dimension of artwork is relevant for its artistic value or aesthetic. So there's no entailment from the claim that ethicism is true to the claim that one ought to censor morally bad work. For all that ethicism shows is that an artwork with certain moral defects thereby has an aesthetic defect, yet having an aesthetic defect is no ground for censoring art. So Gaut also gives all sorts of reasons for rejecting the possibility of measuring the impact of art, but he doesn't think this is the problem. He says, well, there are different ways in which can talk about the relation between ethics and aesthetics, and we can do that completely independently of the causal claim. And he goes on to write an entire book about how to do that. That's his famous 207 book. On the other hand, right, also those who work within aesthetic cognitivism are kind of ignoring the problem of the empirical challenge, and they develop theoretical accounts of aesthetic cognitivism based on mostly their personal experience. I will just mention 3 examples, and later in the Q&A we can go into more details. But for example, McGregor develops, after rejecting the possibility of conducting empirical research, he develops his what he calls narrative justice methodology, with the aim of showing that exposure to good, he calls them exemplary works of narration, whether fictional or non-fictional, that doesn't matter for him, but exposure to such works is actually very good because it can allow you to understand what he calls the causes of harm. So by engaging with art, you understand better why certain people provoke harmful behavior, and then when you kind of, he says, when you go through that same experience, you are more aware of how you might be inflicting and causing pain to other people. Then there is Spivak, her famous book, Aesthetic Education. She develops a view that art is very, very important for who we are as human beings, but she says bluntly, very bluntly, that she can't prove any of that. That is basically all rests on her own opinions and her own experience. A few years ago, Philip Teacher had an amazing book on that in Venice, and he has this very elaborate theory whereby through engagement with art, he says a certain, as he calls them, synthetic complex develops in your mental economy, and you become more reflective about your own judgments, right? And as he sees these kind of judgments based or developed on the basis of what you read or seen on television and in theater, that becomes a very stable part of your mental economy and something that you really apply in your judgment of the world. And of course, if you engage with good works of art, let's say, this is Carroll's example, right, Raisin in the Sun, you will give up on your racist attitudes, or you will, if you watch a movie like Boys Don't Cry, you will kind of develop sensibility towards homosexual people, even if originally you were very much a homophobe yourself. So these are some of the aesthetic cognitivist answers to empirical challenge. Let's just ignore the empirical part altogether, and let's just develop a theory claiming that art is cognitively and ethically valued. Now, I worry about that, and I think that all these views are in a way problematic. So the God's answer to just continue the debate between value interaction debate, or aesthetic cognitivist response who just go on defending the cognitive value of literature, both are problematic, and this is just a very quick overview as to why. So for example, consider again McGregor's theory, right? There is at least one, but I think there are many more aspects in the theory that are just problematic. So his notion of lucid phenomenal knowledge, right, as he says, this is knowledge about what's causing the harm. This is something that becomes available to spectators who duplicate characters' experience, right? Thanks, Teresa. So the problem is, I'm not sure that this happens, right? And of course, many people of cognitive orientation, like Noel Carroll or Carl Plantinga, have offered very convincing arguments claiming that we don't, in fact, identify with characters, which means that we don't duplicate their experience, right? So unless you can provide me with empirical evidence that we in fact do so, I don't think that we should embrace a theory that McGregor here argues for, though his theory is in every other way something that I fully embrace, I have to say. And also there are additional questions which people like McGregor or like Kitcher don't really consider. And that's the question of duplicating the wrong character, right? So these are the abbreviations which stand for moral improvement through art or moral deterioration through art. Recall how God originally formulated the causal claim, right? So what exactly will determine whether or not we duplicate the good guy or the bad guy, right? There are always good and bad people. So why claim that you will necessarily take the moral attitude of the good guy? It's so much more fun sometimes to just be a very bad, a baddie. So why just not go with the bad model? And of course, what happens if you duplicate the wrong character, right? You might end up being worse off than if you've never even read the book or seen the movie. So there are all sorts of problems that the cognitivism who kind of ignore the causal claim and the empirical challenge. And then there are also problems with value interaction debate. So there, I think, which is something that God doesn't consider, their personal and public relevance of causal claim. Because remember, it can go either towards moral improvement or towards moral corruption or deterioration. And notice that if true, they both have very serious consequences for our ethical character, for the kind of people that we are, right? And also it is true, the kind of people that we are, that we relate to other people and we do certain things to other people. So if there's reason to assume that we can become morally better through works of art, and if we want better societies, well, that might be a way towards there, right? So let's just engage with good works of art. And of course, on the other hand, if we can become moral bastards, right? We don't want people who are morally bad around us. So if that were the case, then perhaps Plato's call for censorship would really be something that we should take seriously. So bottom line, the value interaction debate cannot proceed without taking into consideration causal claim, because, well, there is the social aspect of art, and there is also a need for cooperation with others, which presupposes that we do need to care about our ethical characters. And I'm really reaching my conclusion now. And there is an additional argument that I develop against value interaction debate. I hope you can see the dialogues here. So basically, remember that value interaction debate is mostly related to high art. So whether Madame Bovary is a bad work of art because Emma is very promiscuous, that's the kind of question that God is interested in. But it seems to me that low art, being the most dominant and the much after art form currently available, we do need to take it seriously when we are talking about ethical criticism of art. So just imagine, just think of how many people would rather sit in front of shows like How I Met Your Mother and relax than take, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, right? And probably many more people will be continually much more exposed to these kinds of ethical choices. So for example, just in case you can't see the text here, this is a Barney Stinson kind of, there are rules of cheating. It's not cheating if you are not the one who's married. It's not cheating if her name has two adjunct vowels, and it's not cheating if she's from a different area code, right? So obviously this might, if you actually take this as your moral standard, you might end up having quite a lot of unethical and immoral choices in front of you. And also the second reason, I think, by focusing more on the low art, I think we would get a better understanding of the relation between artistic aspect of an artwork and its apparent moral impact. So even if you are only interested in the value interaction debate, right, still do good to focus on the low art, because it would understanding how low art, if it does impacts us, that would help us understand better the whole point about something being artistically high or being artistically low. And just before I present my final slide, I know that for some people this will be quite a problematic. So you can say that I'm ignoring the autonomy of art, however you want to understand autonomism. Or even worse, you can say that I'm instrumentalizing art, right? Art and ethics may interact, so there might very well be reasons for us to engage with ethical criticism. But the way I did it here, it might seem as if I am kind of trying to use art for the purposes of moral education, which of course it's a form of instrumentalization, and it's not necessarily what art is supposed to be doing, right? So why ignore everything else there is about art and just use it for the moral improvement? And I need to say that's not what I'm doing at all. So I don't want to, as I said at the beginning, I don't want to engage with this autonomist view. I think it's a very interesting, and we can talk about that. But as I mentioned back when I first started, what interesting to me is the fact that we are already assuming that there is a certain ethical aspect of art. So given that we are doing that, let's just try and see how the two interact. That doesn't necessarily mean that we won't be engaging with other ways in which to appreciate art. So it's not that I'm doing all of this just to decide which works to give to my children or to my students or to my, family, etc. That's not what we are doing here. In the sense, I think my account goes to claiming that ethical evaluation is a much needed practice which matters to the public and to the community and should not be confined solely within art and philosophy departments. So in order for that to happen, what we need to develop, I think, is the need for more informed discussions of art. And though I won't talk about this here, part of this more informed discussion will also include all various autonomous and all various which the most immoral work of art kind of being afraid. And briefly, this is my last slide, just to briefly explain how then do I want to develop my first of all, I think we should definitely move beyond perspectivism. So there's many more interesting things to talk about when we talked about ethical criticism of art than if we only talk about a perspective being given. And also what we need to do is we need to unite a wider context of research. And this should include at least some of the following. So we definitely need your film theories, but we also need sociology, anthropology, history to understand art, but also to understand art historical context. And I think this is very important because very often what happens is that certain works of art, and you can think here about Madame Bovary. This is also something that we had in Croatia a few years ago. There was this terrible human being who calls herself a representative of the initiation called, let's say, roughly translated, in the name of the family, and she wanted to expel tall people like writers like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Flaubert from the school syllabus on the account of their works being immoral. And obviously, it seems to me her fault was that she just didn't understand the art historical context of creation. So it seems to me, and this is what many amazing critics did, if you explain to someone the context within which Madame Bovary was written and the kind of female situation in which Emma finds herself, right, then you can no longer see the work only as portraying an immoral character. So there's much more value to be given to this work than if you only consider the perspective, and the perspective being, well, Emma is cheating, right? And there are these wonderful descriptions of how beautiful it is cheating, etc., etc. So we do definitely need artists and art critics to help us explain the content of the work of art if we are to properly engage in ethical criticism. And of course, notice that this goes also to philosophy. It can be very hard today to kind of argue in favor of Aristotle, given what he says about females, given what he says about slavery, etc. So notice that the problems with art are not necessarily related only to the domain of art. And this is also something that I think critics tend to ignore. Then I think we should definitely engage with cognitive sciences and empirical psychology. in order to unravel the operative mechanisms behind causal impact. So for example, if you have a good work of art, and I'm really finishing now, if you have a work of art which can make you morally a better person, but for some reason you are not, I think, it's not only the fault of the work of art, and this is something that anti-cognitivists like to point out, but I think we should be more open towards exploring, for example, moral motivation and moral psychology of people. And the analogy that I develop here is the analogy with documentaries. There are all sorts of good documentaries about, in my case, why I shouldn't eat chocolate, right? Because it's terrible and the sugar will just make you want it more. And I know and I understand all of that, because it was a very good documentary. But for whatever reason, I still want to go out, and I probably will go, and I will buy myself a very big ice cream. So it's not, having knowledge which art or documentaries can provide, it's not enough to be motivated to do the right thing. And this is something that those who criticize art for good, art which can make you better, tend to ignore very often. So we do need cognitive sciences, and we do need empirical psychology to help us understand what happens when we are under the influence of art. And also we do need to take into account phenomenology of art experiences. And I primarily have in mind here a recent work by Jonathan Gilmore. It is an amazing work. I deeply recommend it. And I think what he does is he's trying to show whether our rational and emotional whether our attitudes and emotions towards fictional domains should follow the same norms of rationality as our non-artistic or non-fictional domains, right? And I think his research is important because, for example, if his research managed to show that we really do not fall under the influence of characters like Charlie Harper, for example, right? Then we have absolutely no problem engaging with the show on a daily basis throughout, a year long. That's how in Croatia there are these constant reruns, right? So if we could understand better why we develop certain reactions, why we tend to connect to those characters rather than to some other characters, right? That kind of knowledge would help us understand how art impacts us. And I think that would help us understand when and, under which circumstances we should be worried about exposing ourselves to, let's say, wrong works of art, and when we shouldn't, right? Maybe there is a point of our lives when we are completely, morally formed people, and no work of art is capable of kind of diminishing that kind of moral code. We should also consider, of course, aesthetics, because I don't want to exclude artistic aspects. And of course, the list goes on. For example, we do need political philosophy to tell us something about the public policies, which very often tend to operate when it comes to the kinds of public art that we are exposed to. For example, in theaters, right? And also, obviously, various debates of hate speech will also matter here. Just think about the stand-up comedy and the kind of criticism that these people tend to get. So to conclude, in order to properly conduct an ethical approach to, or an ethical criticism of art, it's not enough to only look at art. We need to extend this, and we need to include quite a lot of additional research. So thank you very much for your attention.